You've noticed it, haven't you? That strange, hollow ache that comes when you accomplish something meaningful entirely on your own? You reach the summit, you solve the problem, you break through to the other side of whatever struggle has been consuming you, and there's no one there to witness it, no one to turn to and say, "I did it." The victory feels real, but somehow incomplete, like a joke told to an empty room. And in that moment, a question surfaces that you've probably been avoiding. Why does it hurt so much to grow alone? You tell yourself it shouldn't matter. Growth is growth, right? Whether witnessed or unseen, whether celebrated or silent, the transformation is real. You're stronger, wiser, more capable than you were before. But here's what keeps gnawing at you. The accomplishment feels less real without someone to validate it. The breakthrough feels less significant without someone to understand what it cost you. And worst of all, you start wondering if maybe, just maybe, you're fundamentally broken for needing that recognition in the first place. After all, shouldn't true strength be sufficient? Shouldn't genuine growth be its own reward? But what if I told you that this pain you're feeling, this ache of growing without witnesses, isn't a weakness in your character, but rather the most profound philosophical crisis of human existence? What if the very thing you're judging yourself for reveals something extraordinary about the nature of reality itself? Let me explain what's really happening here. Because what you're experiencing isn't just loneliness, and it's not just a childish need for approval. What you're confronting is something the philosopher Martin Heidegger spent his entire life trying to articulate: the fundamental impossibility of being fully seen, and the unbearable weight of existence that this impossibility creates. You see, we spend most of our lives operating under a comforting illusion. We believe that when we share our experiences with others, when we tell them what we've been through, when we show them our wounds and victories, that they actually understand. We think that our inner world can be transmitted, translated, made visible to another consciousness. This belief is so foundational to how we navigate reality that we rarely question it. It's the basis of all intimacy, all friendship, all love. The idea that we can be known. But here's what you're discovering in these moments of solitary growth. That belief is a beautiful lie we tell ourselves to make existence bearable. No one can actually access your experience. Not really. They can hear your words, see your tears, observe your triumphs. But the felt reality of what you've been through, the texture of your inner transformation, the specific flavor of your suffering and breakthrough, that remains forever locked inside the prison of your subjective experience. Heidegger called this the ownmost character of existence. What he termed Gemenigkeit, the minus of being. Your existence is irrevocably, inescapably your own. No one can experience it for you. No one can truly inhabit your perspective, and most crucially, no one can take away the burden of having to exist as you. This isn't pessimism, it's phenomenology, a description of the actual structure of human reality. And if this is hitting different for you, if you're starting to see your own life reflected in this, consider staying. We explore these depths every single week, and you already know this isn't surface-level content. You know where the button is. Think about it this way. When you try to explain a profound personal experience to someone else, what actually happens? You convert the raw, ineffable reality of what you lived through into language. Language is a shared system, a public tool, and the moment you use it, you've already betrayed the experience. You've squeezed something infinite and particular into finite, general categories. The words, "I felt afraid," or "I finally understood," or "something in me shifted," are like trying to capture the ocean in a thimble. The experience itself was vast, multidimensional, saturated with subtle textures and meanings that exist below the threshold of language. But to communicate it, you have to simplify, generalize, approximate. And even if you could find perfect words, which you can't, the person listening is receiving those words through the filter of their own experience. When you say grief, they hear their grief, not yours. When you say breakthrough, they map it onto their own moments of clarity, which have a completely different architecture than yours. You're speaking about your reality, but they're constructing their interpretation of your reality. And those two things can never perfectly align. There's always a gap, always a mistranslation, always a fundamental, unbridgeable distance between what you mean and what they understand. This is what's happening when you feel that hollow ache after growing alone. You're not just sad that no one was there to celebrate with you, you're confronting the existential reality that even if someone had been there, even if you had witnesses, they still couldn't have truly seen you. The aloneness isn't circumstantial, it's metaphysical. You are alone in your existence, not because you happen to be physically isolated, but because isolation is built into the structure of consciousness itself. Let me give you an analogy that might make this more visceral. Imagine you're exploring a vast, complex labyrinth. Not a simple maze with clear paths and walls, but something far stranger. A three-dimensional space that shifts and reconfigures based on your movement through it, where each corridor you choose changes the architecture of what comes next. This labyrinth is your life, your inner experience, the territory of your consciousness. Now imagine you're walking through this labyrinth with someone you love. They're right beside you, holding your hand. You turn a corner and encounter something extraordinary, a room filled with crystalline structures that sing when light hits them, or a chasm that seems to contain entire universes, or a mirror that shows you something about yourself you'd never seen before. You experience this moment fully, it transforms you, and you want desperately to share it, so you turn to the person beside you and describe what you're seeing. But here's what you don't realize: they're in their own labyrinth. Yes, they're walking alongside you in physical space. Yes, they can see your face, hear your voice, observe your reactions. But the room you're experiencing, the crystalline structures, the chasm, the mirror, those exist inside your labyrinth, not theirs. When you describe what you're seeing, they create a mental image based on your words, but that image exists in their labyrinth, constructed from their memories, their associations, their own past encounters with similar-sounding things. They're seeing something, but it's not what you're seeing. It's their mind's reconstruction of your description of your experience. You keep walking together, and you start to notice this strange phenomenon. Every time something profound happens in your labyrinth, every moment of beauty or terror or transformation, you describe it, and they respond with empathy and understanding. But there's always something slightly off in their response, some subtle indication that they're not quite seeing what you're seeing. And you tell yourself you're just not explaining it well enough. If you could only find better words, more precise descriptions, then surely they would understand. But then comes a moment, maybe many moments, where something changes in your labyrinth and there's no one there to even attempt the translation. You navigate a difficult passage alone. You discover something about yourself in solitude. You grow through a crisis that no one else witnesses. And when you emerge on the other side, you realize something that makes the loneliness exponentially worse, even if someone had been there. Even if you'd had the perfect words, they still would have been in their own labyrinth. The fundamental aloneness of the experience wouldn't have changed. Once your eyes adjust to this reality, once you really see it, you understand what Heidegger meant when he said that existence is something each of us must do for ourselves. No one can take over the burden of your existing. No one can bear your anxiety, your grief, your growth on your behalf. And more than that, no one can ever truly validate your experience. Because validation would require them to access something they can never access: the interiority of your consciousness. This is what's happening when that hollow ache opens up after solitary growth. You're not being dramatic or needy, you're confronting the metaphysical structure of human reality. You're seeing through the comforting illusion of shared experience and recognizing the existential solitude that lies beneath all our attempts at connection. And if you're still with me, if this is resonating somewhere deep, maybe it's time to join the space where we go deeper every week. Subscribe if you want to keep going this far down. You already know what this is. Now, here's where most people make a catastrophic mistake. When they first glimpse this reality, when they feel the weight of existential aloneness, they try to solve it by seeking more connection, more intimacy, more witnesses to their life. They think, maybe I just haven't found the right people yet. Maybe if I can just explain myself better, be more vulnerable, find someone who truly gets me, then this feeling will go away. So they double down on connection. They overshare, hoping that more information will bridge the gap. They seek validation more intensely, thinking that if enough people acknowledge their experience, it will start to feel real. They chase relationships that promise perfect understanding, looking for that mythical soulmate who will finally see them completely. But this is like trying to escape your labyrinth by running faster through the corridors. The problem isn't that you're not moving fast enough or that you haven't found the right path. The problem is that the labyrinth itself is inescapable. The more desperately you seek external validation, the more you reinforce the very gap you're trying to close. Because every act of seeking validation is an implicit acknowledgement that your experience isn't real or complete until someone else confirms it, which only deepens your dependence on something that can never actually be achieved. Nietzsche saw this clearly when he wrote about the herd mentality, the way people surrender their own reality to the interpretations of others because they can't bear the weight of their own existence. But here's what he understood that most miss. This surrender doesn't actually relieve the burden. It just covers it with a layer of distraction and self-deception. Underneath, the existential aloneness remains, now compounded by the shame of having tried to escape it. The hunger for external validation, when it becomes desperate, creates a vicious cycle. You grow, you change, you have experiences, and you immediately need to convert them into stories that others can validate. But in the process of making your experience shareable, you start to unconsciously shape the experience itself around what can be validated. You begin to have experiences for the sake of sharing them, living not from your own center, but from an imagined audience's perspective. And paradoxically, this makes you feel even more alone, because now you're not even fully present to your own life. You're performing it. What's actually required here is something that sounds almost cruel in its simplicity, but I need you to hear it. You have to accept the aloneness not as a temporary condition to be solved, but as the permanent structure of existence. You have to recognize that growing alone isn't a failure of connection, but the only way growth actually happens. Let me name what this state actually is. It's what Heidegger called authentic solitude, or what we might call existential maturity. It's not loneliness, which is the painful awareness of lacking something you think you should have. It's not isolation, which is a withdrawal from connection. It's something entirely different. The conscious acknowledgement that your existence is fundamentally your own, that no one else can live it for you or validate it into being, and that this fact, while sometimes painful, is actually what makes genuine growth possible. Here's what characterizes this state. First, your experiences stop requiring external confirmation to feel real. When something significant happens, when you have a breakthrough or face a crisis, the realness of that moment doesn't depend on whether anyone else witnessed it or understood it. The transformation occurred in the territory of your consciousness, and that's where its reality lives. You might still choose to share it with others, but you're no longer doing so from a place of needy desperation, of requiring their understanding to make the experience legitimate. Second, you develop a different relationship with communication itself. You stop trying to make others see exactly what you saw, feel exactly what you felt, understand exactly what you understood. Instead, you recognize that when you share your experience, what you're actually doing is inviting others to have their own experience in response to your words. The gap between your meaning and their understanding stops being a problem to be solved and becomes simply the nature of communication. You speak your truth not to have it perfectly received, but because the act of articulating it clarifies it for yourself. Third, and this is crucial, you stop mistaking companionship for the alleviation of existential solitude. You can walk alongside others, you can love them, you can build a life with them, but you no longer expect them to dissolve the fundamental aloneness of your existence. They exist in their labyrinth, you exist in yours, and the beauty of connection lies not in pretending the labyrinths are the same, but in the mysterious fact that to separate isolated consciousnesses can walk parallel to each other through entirely different inner worlds, and occasionally, miraculously, find points of resonance. And here's what nobody tells you about this state. It's not dramatic. It doesn't feel like some grand philosophical achievement. In fact, it might feel like nothing special at all, just a quiet acceptance, a subtle shift in how you hold your own experience. The mind, trained to seek intensity, to measure growth by how much it hurts or how radically it transforms you, often dismisses this state precisely because it lacks that addictive quality of crisis and breakthrough. It's too simple, too undramatic, too much like nothing. Hit the like button if you're seeing something here you haven't seen anywhere else. Drop a comment if this is touching something real. And subscribe if you want to keep going deeper, because this is where we go now. I must warn you about something. You might think this sounds rather bleak. You might be hearing this and thinking, so what? I'm just supposed to accept that I'm fundamentally alone and stop seeking connection? That sounds like giving up. That sounds like resignation to isolation. And I understand why it seems that way. The mind wants dramatic solutions, clear action steps, some way to take this insight and weaponize it into a strategy for feeling better. But here's what you must understand. I'm not describing isolation or the abandonment of connection. I'm describing the only foundation from which genuine connection becomes possible. Because real intimacy, the kind that actually nourishes rather than depletes, doesn't come from two people desperately trying to breach each other's existential solitude. It comes from two people who have each accepted their own aloneness and choose to walk alongside each other anyway, without expectation of merger, without the demand that the other make their existence feel less burdensome. The philosopher Rainer Maria Rilke understood this when he wrote that love is to solitudes, protecting and touching, and greeting each other. Not two halves making a whole, not two people completing each other's lack, but two complete, fundamentally alone beings who create something between them precisely because they're not trying to dissolve into each other. Think about it. The neediest relationships, the most suffocating connections, are always between people who can't bear their own existence and are desperately trying to use the other person as a shield against their existential. They demand constant reassurance, constant validation, constant proof that the other person sees them and understands them. And no matter how much reassurance they get, it's never enough, because the underlying problem, the inability to accept the structure of existence itself, remains untouched. Whereas the people who seem most capable of deep connection, who create relationships that feel spacious and alive, rather than clingy and desperate, are almost always people who have made peace with their aloneness. They don't need you to validate their experience, so when they share with you, it's an offering rather than a demand. They don't need you to complete them, so they can appreciate you as you actually are, rather than as a solution to their existential anxiety. The paradox is this: the more you accept that growing alone is inevitable, the more available you become for genuine companionship. The more you stop requiring others to witness and validate your transformation, the more freely you can share it. The less desperate you are to be seen, the more you actually allow yourself to be seen, because you're no longer performing for validation, but simply revealing what's true. Let me tell you about someone I know. Not personally, but through their writing, their life trajectory, the traces they left behind. A writer, mid-30s, moderately successful. From the outside, their life looked well-connected, plenty of friends, active social life, a partner who seemed supportive. But they described a particular kind of suffering in their journals, a suffering they couldn't quite articulate to anyone around them. They were growing rapidly, intellectually and emotionally, reading philosophy that changed how they understood everything, having insights about their own patterns that felt revolutionary, doing the hard internal work of facing their wounds and transforming their relationship to themselves. But none of the people in their life could really track with them. Not because these people were unsupportive or uncaring, but because the territory this writer was navigating was so internal, so specific to their own consciousness, that it simply couldn't be shared in any meaningful way. They'd come home from a long solitary walk where something had shifted in their understanding, and they'd try to explain it to their partner. And their partner would listen with genuine care and say something supportive, something that indicated they were trying to understand. But the writer could feel the gap, could sense that the words landing in their partner's ears were creating a completely different picture than the reality they'd experienced. And that gap, that unbridgeable distance, started to feel unbearable. For months, they spiraled into increasingly desperate attempts to be understood. Longer explanations, more vulnerability, seeking out new friends who might get it better, journaling obsessively as if documenting the experience in perfect detail might somehow make it more real or shareable, but nothing worked. In fact, the more they tried to be understood, the more isolated they felt, because every failed attempt at communication was a reminder of the fundamental impossibility of the task. Then, something shifted. Not dramatically, not through any grand realization or breakthrough moment, but through simple exhaustion. They just got tired. Tired of trying to translate their inner world into shareable content. Tired of measuring the realness of their growth by whether anyone else could validate it. tired of the whole project of being understood, so they stopped. They kept growing, kept having insights, kept transforming, but they stopped trying to package it for others. They wrote in their journal not to create a record someone else might someday read and understand, but simply because the act of writing helped them think. They had experiences of solitary beauty and didn't immediately reach for their phone to share them. They went through internal crises and came out the other side without needing to debrief anyone about what happened. And a strange thing occurred. The aloneness didn't diminish. Exactly, they were still navigating their labyrinth in fundamental solitude, but it stopped feeling like a problem. The growth started feeling real on its own terms. Not because anyone witnessed it, but because it was simply happening, changing the structure of their consciousness from the inside. And paradoxically, their relationships improved. Without the desperate need to be understood, they could be present to others in a way they hadn't been before. They could listen without constantly relating everything back to their own experience. Could appreciate the otherness of other people rather than trying to find themselves reflected everywhere. This is what's happening when you move from desperate seeking to acceptance. Something in you dies. Absolutely. The part of you that believed perfect understanding was possible, the part that measured the significance of your growth by external validation, the part that couldn't bear to exist alone in your own consciousness, that part dies. And it feels like dying because something is dying. But what's being born in its place, what emerges from that death, is a capacity to actually live your own life rather than constantly narrating it for an imagined audience. If you're feeling this, if something in you is recognizing itself in these words, don't just scroll past like this video so others who need to hear it can find it. Comment with what's coming up for you, and subscribe, because we're doing this every single week, going to places most content won't touch. You are in the middle of this process now. The ache you feel when you grow alone, when you reach a new understanding that no one witnesses, when you transform in ways that can't be adequately explained to anyone else, that ache is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It's not proof that you're too isolated or not trying hard enough to connect. It's the growing pain of consciousness maturing into its own existential structure. This is not a mistake. This is how it works. The labyrinth is yours and yours alone, and no amount of wishing will make it otherwise. But here's what shifts when you accept this. The labyrinth stops feeling like a prison and starts feeling like your actual home. Not a place you're trapped in, but the very territory of your existence. The space where your consciousness lives and moves and grows. And let me be clear about something crucial. Accepting this doesn't mean becoming a stoic island, pretending you don't need anyone, cultivating some sort of proud isolation. That's just the ego's way of turning acceptance into another strategy for feeling superior. No, what I'm describing is something much more humble. Simply recognizing that your existence is your own to live, that no one else can do it for you, and that the validation you seek can only come from the living itself, not from external confirmation. So, what do you actually do with this understanding? Because if you're anything like most people, you're hearing this and part of you is already trying to turn it into a technique, some method you can apply to fix the problem of existential aloneness. And I need to be clear, there is no technique here. The whole point is that this isn't a problem to be solved, but a reality to be inhabited. But there are ways to orient yourself toward this reality that make it more bearable, more workable. Not strategies for escaping the aloneness, but practices for dwelling in it without constant suffering. First, stop narrating. Notice how often your mind is converting your present experience into a story someone else might hear. You have an insight, and immediately your inner voice is explaining it as if to an audience. You go through something difficult, and you're already planning how you'll describe it to your therapist or your friend or your journal. This constant narration creates a split in your consciousness, a division between the one who experiences and the one who performs the experience for an imagined other. Try this instead. When something significant happens, when you feel yourself growing or changing or understanding something new, let it be unstoried at least for a while. Don't immediately reach for language. Don't start crafting the explanation. Just be in the experience. Let it move through you. Let it change you, without the mediating layer of narrative. You might find that experiences allowed to remain unstoried have a different kind of realness, a more direct contact with your consciousness that doesn't require the validation of being shareable. Second, watch your impulse to seek validation without immediately acting on it. Notice when you accomplish something alone and the first impulse is to tell someone. Don't judge the impulse, but also don't automatically obey it. Create some space between the impulse and the action. In that space, ask yourself, what am I actually seeking? Is it genuine connection, or is it trying to make the accomplishment feel real through someone else's recognition? Sometimes you'll realize you're genuinely wanting to share joy or connect with someone, and that's fine. Go ahead and share. But other times you'll notice you're seeking validation because some part of you doesn't trust that the experience was real unless someone else confirms it. And in those moments, the most powerful thing you can do is nothing. Let the experience stand on its own. Let your growth be unseen. Not as a punishment or a test, but as a practice in trusting the reality of your own consciousness without external confirmation. Third, stop trying to make others understand you completely. This doesn't mean don't communicate or don't share your inner world. It means release the expectation that they should or could perfectly grasp what you're experiencing. When you share something meaningful and the person responds with something that misses the mark, let that be okay. Their understanding is necessarily filtered through their own consciousness, their own labyrinth, and expecting them to transcend that is expecting them to violate the basic structure of reality. Instead, appreciate whatever resonance does occur. If someone hears your words and something in them shifts, even if it's not exactly what you meant to convey, even if they're having their own experience rather than perfectly grasping yours, that's still connection. It's just a different kind than you were demanding. It's connection that respects the fundamental otherness of other consciousnesses rather than trying to dissolve that otherness. And fourth, stop comparing your internal transformation to external metrics. Growth that happens alone, growth that can't be measured or witnessed or validated by others. That growth tends to feel less real to us because we've been conditioned to trust only what can be made visible and shared. But the deepest transformations of consciousness are almost always invisible. They happen in the privacy of your inner world, in moments no one sees, in subtle shifts of perspective that can't be photographed or proven or explained to anyone else. Learn to trust those invisible transformations. When something shifts in how you relate to your anxiety, when you find yourself responding differently to an old trigger, when you notice that a pattern that used to control you no longer has the same grip, these are real changes, even if no one else can verify them. The fact that they can't be shared on social media or explained at dinner parties doesn't make them less significant. In fact, it might make them more significant because they're not being performed for any audience. They're simply how you actually are now. Here's the final paradox you need to hold. Accepting that you must grow alone doesn't mean you have to suffer the aloneness. Suffering comes from resistance, from the constant friction between reality and how you think reality should be. When you're fighting against existential solitude, demanding that it shouldn't be this way, seeking endlessly for some connection that will dissolve it, that's when the aloneness becomes unbearable. But when you accept it, when you stop fighting the fundamental structure of your existence, something remarkable happens. The aloneness doesn't disappear, but it loses its sting. It becomes just a fact, like gravity or time, something that simply is, rather than something wrong that needs fixing. And in that acceptance, a strange kind of peace emerges. Not the peace of having solved a problem, but the peace of finally stopping the exhausting battle against reality itself. Like this video, if it's shifting something in you, comment so we know you're here. Subscribe if you want more of this depth, because this conversation isn't ending. You're not broken for feeling this pain. You're not deficient because growing alone feels hollow sometimes. What you're experiencing is consciousness becoming aware of its own structure, existence, waking up to its own nature. And yes, that waking hurts. It hurts because you're releasing an illusion you didn't even know you were holding. The illusion that perfect understanding between consciousnesses is possible, that you could ever be fully seen or fully known. But here's what you gain in exchange for that loss. Your life becomes yours in a way it never was before. When you stop requiring external validation for your growth to feel real, when you stop needing others to witness and confirm your transformation, you're no longer living for an audience. You're living from your own center, moving through your own labyrinth according to your own inner navigation, growing not because it impresses anyone, but because it's what consciousness does when it's fully alive. This is what authentic existence looks like. According to Heidegger, not some heroic isolation, not some tragic loneliness, but simply the courage to be the being that you are. To own the fact that your existence is irreducibly your own, that no one can live it for you or validate it into being. Most people spend their entire lives running from this reality, seeking endlessly for some other person or achievement or recognition that will finally make them feel real. But all that seeking is just another form of self-abandonment, another way of refusing to take responsibility for the weight of your own existence. What I'm inviting you into is the opposite of abandonment. It's the radical act of coming home to yourself, of recognizing that the consciousness reading these words right now, the awareness that's been following this argument and feeling these resonances, that's the only home you'll ever have. Not in a depressing way, but as a simple fact. And once you accept that fact, once you stop fighting it and start living from it, everything changes. The relationships you form become cleaner, less neurotic, less burdened by impossible expectations. The growth you undergo becomes more real, more grounded in actual transformation rather than performance. The moments of solitary insight or accomplishment stop feeling like deficits and start feeling like the natural rhythm of consciousness evolving. You're still alone in the fundamental sense, still navigating your labyrinth in irreducible solitude. But you're no longer suffering that aloneness because you've stopped expecting it to be otherwise. And here's the extraordinary thing. Other people who have made this same acceptance, who have stopped fighting their existential solitude and learned to inhabit it with grace, you can recognize them. Not through any external marker or shared language, but through a quality of presence, a way of being with others that doesn't demand anything, doesn't need anything, but simply is. And when two people who have accepted their aloneness encounter each other, something strange happens. They can be together without merging, can connect without losing themselves, can appreciate each other's otherness rather than trying to dissolve it. This is the only real companionship available to human beings. Not the false promise of perfect understanding, but the humble recognition that we're each walking our own labyrinth in fundamental solitude. And yet, somehow, mysteriously, beautifully, we can walk parallel to each other, can share this strange condition of existence, can create meaning together, even though meaning itself is always built through the irreducible privacy of individual consciousness. So, when you feel that ache, that hollow feeling after growing alone, after reaching some new understanding with no one there to witness it, remember what's really happening. You're not experiencing a failure of connection, you're experiencing the truth of existence. And the pain you feel isn't evidence that something is wrong. It's evidence that you're awake enough to see reality as it actually is, rather than as you wish it would be. The path forward isn't to seek more witnesses, more validation, more people who might finally understand you completely. The path forward is to accept that complete understanding is impossible, that your growth is yours alone, and that this fact, while sometimes painful, is also what makes you a sovereign consciousness capable of genuine transformation. You're already walking your labyrinth. You've always been walking it alone, even when you thought you had company. The only question is whether you'll continue to suffer that aloneness by demanding it be otherwise, or whether you'll accept it and discover the strange freedom that acceptance brings. You don't need anyone to validate this moment. You don't need anyone to confirm that what you're reading right now is hitting something real in your consciousness. You know it is. That knowledge doesn't require external confirmation. It exists in the privacy of your awareness, and that's where its reality lives. This is the beginning of existential maturity. Recognizing that growing alone isn't a bug in the system of human existence, but the fundamental feature of consciousness itself. And once you see that, once you really accept it, the ache doesn't disappear entirely, but it transforms into something else, something quieter, something that feels less like suffering and more like the simple weight of being alive. You are alone. You will always be alone in the deepest sense. And paradoxically accepting this is what finally allows you to stop being lonely,